Hey folks, my name is Victor, and today I want to tell you about a tool called Annex. So Annex is a set of Angular CLI power-ups that transform the CLI into a full-stack development environment. You can build full-stack apps with Annex. It also allows you to sort of adopt dev practices, really good dev practices pioneered at Google. And finally, with Annex, you can easily add modern dev tools such as Cypress or say Jest into your dev workflow. There are a few ways you can use to create a new Annex project. The easiest way is probably to use an npx command, which ships npm. If you run npx and you provision an schematics package, and you invoke create Annex workspace, you can give it a name, and it will create a new project for you. Another way, you can install the package globally, either using npm or yarn, and then you can invoke create Annex workspace from the globally installed package. After running the command, you will see something like this. A new Annex workspace contains the VS Code folder with an extensions file, which recommends a few extensions for you to install. One of those extensions is the Angular console plugin for VS Code, which is a UI for the Angular CLI, right? It allows you to interact with the CLI and with Annex using the UI, which can be very useful. I'm going to use this plugin extensively today, just to show you more visually what you can do. But you don't have to. If you prefer the terminal, use the terminal. Every single command that you see in the console can be run in the terminal, and vice versa. Every single command you can run in the terminal, you can run in the console. Alright, so a new workspace has 3 folders we're interested in. It has the apps folder, where the applications we're running live, the libs folder, where reusable chunks of functionality live, and finally the tools folder, where things that we use to manage the workspace itself live. Let's start by generating a new Angular application by adding an app to our workspace. We can do it by selecting the application schematic and provisioning the name of the application. By default, we're going to use Cypress and Jest for our application, but we can change it. If you want to do what the standard CLI does, you can always change the test runners to be Karma and Protractor instead. I think Cypress and Jest are better options for most projects, so that's why we default to them, so let's use them instead. After we generate an app, we're going to wait for a few seconds while yarn or npm is installing the packages we just added to our package.json. And now we can go to our apps folder, and you can see we have 2 applications, the app itself and the end-to-end test for our application. How to write an end-to-end test is a complex topic, way beyond what I'm going to show you today. So I'm just going to sort of scaffold something that will look like an end-to-end test. I'm going to define 2 helpers, one that will give me a list of to-dos that my application displays, and the other one that will give me the button that I can use to add a new to-do. With these helpers in place, I can go to my spec and use them to build the simplest possible test I can imagine. I can get the list of to-dos and just make sure that I have a few, right? I know that's not how a real end-to-end test is going to look like. That's fine. This is the purpose of this, just to show you that Cypress integration works very smoothly, right? So let's say I have 2 to-dos, and then if I add another one by clicking on that special button, I'm going to have 3 to-dos instead, right? So now I have this simple test. How do I run it? I can always use Angular console to run it, right? Anything I can run in the terminal, I can run in the console. So if I go to my project list, I can click on end-to-end and run it over here. But just to show you that I can use stuff in the terminal, I'm going to run the end-to-end command target in the terminal, and I'm going to pass the --watch flag. That will make sure that the Cypress instance sort of runs in the dev mode and I can interact with it while I'm developing my application. And now if I refresh my test in the browser, I will see that it fails because we don't display any to-dos yet. Okay, let's make it work. Let's implement it. To do it, let's go into our front-end project, into our Angular application, find the component, the app component, and let's just, put all the functionality inside this component. We'll start by defining a type to do, which in our case we just have a title. Very simple type, again, it's a toy app that we're just using to illustrate how everything works. We're going to seed the component with some fake data, with 2 to-dos, right, to make sure our end-to-end test passes, to do 1 and to do 2. And next we're going to define a click handler called add-to-do. And this click handler again is going to be exceptionally basic, right? The only thing it's going to do is it will add a new to-do with a randomly generated name. Now, with this in place, right, we just need to update our template. And again, we're not trying to build any scenario here. So we're going to put together the simplest possible list of to-dos we can imagine. We're going to display the title. We also need to add a class to do so our selector in the test works. And now let's add a button that is going to add our new random to-do. And it's going to invoke the add to do click handler. Now let's refresh our end-to-end test, and they pass. Everything we've done until this point shows how we can build a normal Angular project. Right? You could do something similar in a typical CLI setup. You don't need an X for that, right? What an X added here is that it helped us to use tools like Cypress and Jest instead of tools like Protractor and Karma, which is great, right? Tools like Cypress and Jest can enable you to move forward a lot faster, can actually change the way you develop, and it's fantastic, but NX can do a lot more than that. And one of the coolest things NX can do is with it, you can build a full stack application with a backend and a frontend in the same workspace. You can run the same commands to build your front and the backend, right? You can share code, you can use the same patterns, right, to interact with the whole application. So let me show you how we can do that here. And once again, we're going to use Angular console to generate an artifact in our workspace. If I go to the console, I will select a node application schematic. If I can provision the name, the backend, I will see what my backend application is going to look like. By default, NX uses Nest.js to implement the backend stuff, right? Which is a great framework, but if you don't like it, you can switch to, say, Express, or even set it to none and add your own framework of choice. We are going to use Nest here. In addition to this, we're going to set the front-end projects for our backend. And the only thing that this does is it configures the proxy, which makes the development experience a bit nicer. So now with this in place, we can click on the generate button, and npm or yarn is going to install the packages that were added to our package.json by the schematic. And once this is done, we can go to our Explorer and we can see that both the backend and the frontend are sort of side by side in the apps folder. And that's a key property of NX. We treat the backend and the frontend in exactly the same way. You use same commands to build them, test them, serve them. You interact with them in exactly the same way. And this makes building full stack applications a lot simpler. It's really a refreshing experience being able to build backends, middleware, frontend in exactly the same way using the same tools. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to move the functionality from our frontend to the backend. So we have a service generated by our Nest schematic called app service that's loaded by the app module. And we're just going to use this service as a placeholder for all of our smartness, for all the management of the to-do. So I'm just going to copy the functionality over, copy the to-do type, the array itself, and the handler that adds the new random to-do to the array from the front end to the backend. That's fine, right? That works great. Now let's open our controller, which implements the endpoint we're going to access. and implement two functions here. One will return the list of all to-dos available, and it's called get data that is mapped to API to-dos. And the second one is going to add a new random to-do. Okay. One thing I want to quickly show you is that in the main.ts file, we set a prefix for the whole backend as API. So whatever we access on the backend will be prefixed with /API. Okay. So we have this controller. Now let's update our client side. So we can do it by injecting the HTTP module, HTTP client rather, which we're going to use to get the data from the backend. So in this constructor, I'm going to call fetch, which will be a function that is going to get the data from the backend. We're going to hit /API/to-dos. We're going to get the array of to-dos that the API provides, and we'll just assign it to the field of this class. Again, not the best way to do it in a real app, but works for now. All right, and we're going to change the add to-do similarly to hit the backend. This time we're going to use post. And once we got the confirmation that the to-do was added, we are going to refetch the data. Okay, that's simple, nothing special. So now, what we can do is we can go to Angular console, and Angular console, we can use Angular console to run both the backend and the frontend. So I can start the backend. While it's booting, I can go and start the frontend. And now I have both of them running, right? I can look at the status, at the errors, and stuff like that, right? And here I can click on this link to see the app running in the browser. What we have already here working is quite remarkable. We have a backend and a frontend working together, right? We generate both of them using the same set of tools. We can use the same UI to interact with them. Same commands like ngserve, ngbuild, and ngtest work for them, right? So it's already quite good. But we have a problem, right, which we want to address. And the problem is that the type, the to-do type, is duplicated. We have one copy of it on the backend and another copy on the front end, and that is problematic. Right now the type is very simple, so obviously it works. We know it works, but over time this information will diverge. The two copies will become different, which means it's not just we have to maintain two copies of the same code. They're going to diverge and introduce errors. Runtime errors will creep in, and we'd like to avoid that. Normally, like using normal CLI setup, it's quite challenging to do anything like that, right? To be able to extract a chunk of functionality and use it across projects. But it's trivial in NX. In NX, if we want to do that, we create a library. Again, we can open Angular console, find the library schematic, and give it a name, say data. And we want to make one change. By default, it will create an Angular library where we would like to have just a plain TypeScript library, right? Okay, it looks quite good. Click on generate. And now we can go to Explorer and we can see that we have a library in the libs folder. And the way libraries work in NX is that in opposite to applications that cannot be run, the purpose of a library is to encapsulate some behavior that you can then use in another library or in an application, right? Libraries have public APIs, which cannot be broken. It's statically verified that you respect it. So it's useful to partition your application to libraries, even if you don't want to reuse anything. just to be able to have well-defined units of functionality that have public API, right? Our library here is trivial, right? It's just going to export a single type. So let's just do that. And once we have that, we can import this type from that library in both the backend and the frontend. And next, use advanced code analysis to figure out how your applications and libraries are all wired up together. You can see what Annex figured out by clicking on the Affected Projects tab in the Angular Console plugin. Here you can see, the dependency diagram for this project, which is quite trivial because there are so few nodes. In a larger project, you can have dozens or even hundreds of nodes, so being able to, introspect it is a lot more useful. To show you that we can do even more stuff, right, with libraries, let's create another library. But this time we're going to create a library for our DOM components. We can call it UI. And it's going to be created next to our data library in the same folder. So let's create a component in the UI library. And we can call it, task list, to-do list. Task list is good. Set the project. And let's just say we want to re-export this component. Right? We can see, okay, fantastic, right? It looks correct. We can generate it, and now we have the component created in our library, which is exported, right? So let's just copy some functionality from our app component into the newly created task list component. Just going to copy this over, and we just need to modify the component to create the needed to-dos field. Okay, fantastic. That works, right? Now the only thing that's left, we need to import the newly created module into our application. Now we just need to use the component in our template. Okay, let's see what the dependency diagram looks like right now. Okay, that looks pretty good. One thing to note is that Annex does a fairly good job at figuring out what the dependency diagram is for a project. You don't need to configure anything, it just sort of figures it out. Once in a while, though, you would like to augment it. Right? And you can do it by opening an Annex.json file and adding an implicit dependency. For instance, he would like to say that the front-end project implicitly depends on the backend project. So when the backend project changes, we would like to retest the front-end. Being able to build multiple applications out of small libraries with ease, with almost zero configuration, is one of those best practices that Google is known for. So Annex helps you do that. You can introduce new libraries that you can use across a variety of applications in minutes. Another thing that Google is known for is that if you make a change to a particular library or an application, you don't have to know what can be affected by your change. Right? The tooling, the build system will figure out what can in theory be broken by your commit, and it's going to retest and rebuild only those projects, not everything. If you have to retest everything every single time, you won't be able to build ambitious projects in any setup really, right? You want to make sure that if I touch just a tiny library over here, only that library is retested. To show you how Annex allows for that, let me check in all the changes we've made. And now if I go back to the affected projects screen, I'll see that the diagram changed. Nothing is highlighted in red, right? And I can click on different nodes and see what can be affected by my change. And that's quite handy already. But Annex can do better than that, right? If I go to a file, any file really, and introduce a change, say I added a bank here, I made a small change in this task list component, as you can see. Annex knows about this change. If I go to the affected project screen, I can see it knows that the UI has been touched and that the front-end project is affected, but the backend is not. I can retest the affected nodes by clicking on the button, or I can retest all the affected nodes by using the terminal. As you can see, it's only retesting UI in frontend, but not the backend. Similarly, I can rebuild the affected project as well, the affected apps. And in here I have two apps, frontend and the backend. Because I only touch the UI library, it's only going to rebuild the frontend, not the backend. Right? That's a very important capability that you can rely on this. You don't need to ever worry about maybe I didn't retest what's broken. And it's a more generic capability, right? You can run any target against the affected projects. Any target at all. LinkedIn, you can introduce your own targets. It all works just fine. The next key capability Annex has, which is sort of borrowed from the Google Dev workflow, is the ability to add constraints to the dependency graph. This is very useful. Without it, you cannot really build multiple projects in the same repository. Right? The chaos will ensue. You have to be able to say which imports are allowed, which imports not allowed, what you can depend on, what you cannot depend on. This is a must. To show you how Annex does it, let's imagine that by accident we added our own import into the backend project. Say some PR added the UI module as an import to the backend. This is a problem, right? Because we have to roll Angular into the backend now, which obviously we cannot do. Right? How can we prevent such mistakes? To do it, we need to open the Annex.json file we saw before. And we can use this capability Annex calls tags, where we can annotate our projects with just arbitrary tags. In this case, we decided to introduce a tag called platform. And we will annotate the front-end related project with platform::frontend, the backend projects with platform::backend, and something that can be used in both with platform shared. Okay, now we are going to open TS-link.json, and in here we are going to configure how projects can depend on each other. We're going to introduce constraints. We're going to say that the platform shared projects can only depend on shared projects. You cannot depend on front-end or back-end. Front-end projects can depend on front-end or shared. And similarly, our backend projects can only depend on other backend projects or on shared projects. Okay, with this in place, we need to restart our TS-lint. Let me quickly do that. And once it boots, we will see that there is an error that was added to this import, right? This import is not allowed. This import is going to fail in CI, so which will make sure that your dependency graph is good. So we can clean it up right now. You can do a lot with tags. We show that you can express the platform, say the backend and the frontend. If you have a native script app built in the same workspace, you can have another platform called native script. You can also specify what is private and what is public. You can have a tag for your own team, so no one outside of your team can depend on your projects. You can have tags to mark what's experimental and what's stable, what's meant to be used for production and what's meant to be used for testing or development only. Lots of use cases can be implemented with ease, with just annotating your projects with the right tags. And Next can do a lot more than this. For example, it has a lot of capabilities for enforcing best practices that are useful for larger teams and enterprises. One of them is called Workspace schematics. Let me show you how it works. Once again, we can use the Angular console to create a new workspace schematic. We can give it a name, say Backend lib. It will show us the schematic. We can click on Generate, find the schematic in the Tools folder. There's implementation and the schema. And say this is a very simple schematic that just creates a library with the backend platform tag set correctly, right? Something like this. Without doing anything else, right? Without recompiling anything, we can use the schematic using Angular console. It is that easy. We can give our lib a name. We can, like if we show the preview, as it usually does with normal schematics, we can generate the new backend lib in our workspace. And now if we open next the JSON file, we'll see that the tag is set correctly. That's everything I wanted to show you today. So let's review what we've learned. And next is a set of Angular CLI power-ups. It's not a replacement for the CLI. It's a set of extensions for the CLI. With Next, you can build full-stack applications using Angular and Node.js frameworks such as Nest with ease. You use same commands to generate the backend and the front end. You use same commands to run them. The whole, like the tools like Angular CLI and Angular console works very consistently across the backend and the front end. You can also share code with ease in seconds between your backend and your front end. Next helps you adopt some of the best practices pioneered at Google. For example, you can build your applications as a set of small, well-defined libraries with public API that you cannot break. You can create those libraries to share code. It's very easy, but you can also create them just to partition your large application into something that's meaningful, right? Into a smaller unit that you can reason through effectively. That by itself is fantastic. But to make that experience work, Next does two most important things that you have to do to be able to enable this workflow. And that's what Google does internally. First, it allows you to not worry about how the dependency graph is wired up. Right? When you make a change, Next will figure out what can be affected by your change and will retest and rebuild only what's affected. You cannot build even two projects side by side if you always rebuild and retest everything. Because then every time team A makes a change to project A, they can be affected by a flaky test created by team B. You don't want this to happen, right? Secondly, Next provides a way to impose constraints on your dependency graph. You can say, by using tags, what platform your library or your project runs on, what team owns it, is it experimental or not? And then using those tags, you can establish rules, as I showed today, where certain edges in those graphs, certain imports will be disallowed. Right? Without it, again, you cannot build anything substantial in the single repo. Finally, Next helps you adopt modern tools. Tools like Cypress, Jest, Nest, or Prettier are baked into the Next experience. If you build a normal Angular CLI project, the choices you have aren't between Protractor or Cypress. The choice you have is between a beautiful zero setup experience with Protractor, and a very ad hoc experience you built yourself for Cypress that doesn't really work. NX fixes that. You can use all those modern tools and they work just as well as Protractor or Karma. I hope I convinced you that NX is a fantastic way to build modern applications. If you want to learn more, go to nx.tools. Thank you.